Welcome to the first episode of our relaunched Stamp Chat Season 1. I'm Scott English, Executive Director of the American Philatelic Society. Joining me is a friend of the APS and a familiar face to many of you, David S. Ball, presenting 47 Ways to Collect Airmail. David is president and a life member of the American Airmail Society, celebrating its 100th year. He was formerly executive director of the Spelman Museum of Stamps and Postal History and a retired Air Force officer. David collects aerophilately, especially Lindbergh, polar exploration and flight, and Palestine airmail between the world wars. He is U.S. delegate to the Astrophilatelic section of the FIP, a national philatelic judge, and serves on the APS Expertising Committee. He is a member of the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors, a 25-year member of the APS, the American Society of Polar Philatelists, and the Society of Israel Philatelists. For those watching the presentation live, your microphone and camera are disabled during the presentation. To engage fellow attendees, please make comments in the chat section. If you have a question, please use the Q&A option, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the presentation. If you're watching a recording of this presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the comments section. This program is provided thanks to APS member support. If you're not already a member of the APS or would like more information about our services, please visit our website at stamps.org. David, welcome to Stamp Chat. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate the invitation. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. Today is the 105th anniversary of airmail service in the United States. So between 1918 and 1975, for a premium, you could have your mail sent by air, and that generally made things go faster. After 1975, we just decided first-class mail was going to go the fastest way it could go, and sometimes that's by aircraft, sometimes it's by truck or by train. And so I wanted to try to understand how we collect as aerophilatelists, as people that are interested in airmail. And so I went back to our airmail catalog, which we've been publishing since 1935, and we're in our 7th edition right now. We just published volume 4. And I looked to see what sections in those different editions we had, the ways people were collecting. And it turns out that there are 47. Now, whether going forward we want to have more sections or less sections, but this is what it looked like. So a whole bunch of different ways of collecting it. And you can see sometimes they're in one edition, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they only exist once. Sometimes they exist in every edition. So there are certain things like contract airmail, which is constantly updated. And there are others like catapult, which was only once. So going forward, we kind of have to decide how is it that we're going to collect and how we want to go about that. So I wanted to break up those 47 and just try to be able to get my hand around, my brain around the different areas where people are collecting. So one was U.S. airmail. So it starts with the pioneer flights. These are ones where you'd be at a county fair and they take up the mail and they drop a bag or something like that. But the mail didn't really go anywhere. Then there's U.S. government and contract airmail, AMS, FAMS, First Flight US, a whole bunch of things. So let's take a look at some of them. So here are some of the pioneers, and these are sanctioned by the post office. And so you could send up a penny postcard, and it would fly around, and they'd drop it to your loved one, and that was fun. And then in 1918, the government decided that they were going to offer airmail service between Washington, Philadelphia, and New York, and they created the Jenny stamp, the 24-cent stamp, that would pay the rate to fly your mail. And in addition to paying the first-class rate, it would also pay special delivery to have it delivered to you. So it was definitely a premium service, and so we had this government rate between 1918 and 1926 when we started with contract airmail. And so in Congress, Congressman Kelly in 1925 said, maybe the government shouldn't be in the business of moving the mail. Maybe we should make that a commercial venture. So the airlines bid on routes that the post office established, and they would carry the mail, and they'd be paid different ways. Sometimes they're paid by the piece or the weight. And so this is an example of one of this is the Chicago-Dallas route of contract airmail. And then after the CAMs, which goes to CAM 32, we continued this series, and we call them AMs instead. We call them airmail routes. And so when you see them on the covers and they say AM instead of CAM, that just means that it's generally past that that point where we had CAMs to 34. So you ready for the quiz? Hopefully everybody was ready. Here's the first question, and that is, who wrote the first letter carried aloft in America? Now your choices are Wilbur Wright, Postmaster General James Farley, George Washington, or none of the above. Now, Scott, I don't know, is there any way that people can guess, or what do you think?
They can guess in the chat section if they'd like.
Okay. Let's see, I'm looking in the chat section. Okay, so your choices are Wilbur Wright, Postmaster General James Farley, George Washington, or none of the above. Who wrote the first letter carried aloft in America? Okay, so we're getting a bunch of Wilbur Wrights. We got a Postmaster Farley. Anybody else? Nobody wants D. Oh, I got a C. Foster Miller thinks it's George Washington. Scott Kitchen says it's George Washington. There's a D. Okay. Well, it turns out the answer is C. It's George Washington. So it turns out that a French aeronaut is about to go aloft, and George Washington is there, and he says, here, let me give you this letter of introduction so that when you alight someplace, they'll know that, like, it's okay or something like that. You have my blessing. So he took that, and so it's not mail in the way we imagine mail. It's not that it's addressed to somebody else and it gets delivered, but it's the first letter carried aloft in America. So good job. And you get two more questions. All right. So some of the other ways that people collect, we saw CAMs, and these are FAMs. So this is foreign airmail routes. So again, they'll have a route number. So for example, these are FAM 18s, and sometimes a collector will want to have it do a round trip or go around a funny way. So you can see this one up on the top. It's got a label over it going to the Isle of Wight, and underneath it, it's addressed to the U.S. So they put a whole bunch of different kinds of postage on it, and the letter bounces around for some time. And this one on the bottom here that went to Gimbals, that went out and then came back again. So it's got the mixed franking, right? It's got the British stamps and also the American stamps. And then after the AMs, there are, we call them First Flight US, and these might be first jet flights or first prop jet electors with GM jet motors. There are all kinds of weird ways that we kind of slice and dice these things. You can see this one is addressed to the head of Eastern Airline, Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. He was ace in the Great War. And then at some point we had jet service, because during the Second World War, the Germans were able to develop a jet engine, and then the British were doing it as well. And then we got some of that technology with General Electric, and they started making engines. So people will collect first jet airmail flights, and sometimes you might get them from the beginning of the flight or the end of the flight. So here we can see in Washington, also in Schenectady, where General Motors is, General Electric is, and then also in Chicago. And now this isn't really mail in the traditional sense. US Air Express is a way for the airlines to make more money. So what they would do is instead of you could buy for, let's say, $1, you could buy this label, this Air Express label, and treat this envelope as if it were a package. And so the airline would be entitled to whatever money. So, instead of having a 10-cent stamp to move the mail, they might have 10 cents on it, but also charge you $1. So this was more of a collecting sort of thing, as opposed to having any legitimate value. But we do collect Air Express, and you'll see it has a label on the back. And this one's addressed to the first president of the American Airmail Society. And lots of different places, here to the Philippine Islands. Just some wonderful stuff. I love finding these almond Carters. Carter was the owner of the Fort Worth newspaper, and he was very wealthy. And so he was a philatelist, and he would go on these long Pacific flights on the Clippers, and he'd put all kinds of stamps on stuff and make these custom cachets, and they were just magnificent. He must have had a tremendous collection. And then Okinawa, for a time there are people that collect that. And then a couple of other different ways that we can slice and dice these 47. And one is stamps and stationery. So airmail stamps, right? And you can see there's something wrong with the one on the left. I can't tell what's wrong with it, but and then U.S. airmail stamps. And then people collect etiquettes. So these are the labels that go on the envelope to instruct the post office that this needs to be sent by airmail. So there are a whole bunch of etiquette labels. Not that popular. We only ran it as a section just once. I don't know that we'll do it again, but like everything else, you can tell a story with it. It's something that people will collect. You ready for question 2? Okay, Orville Wright lived long enough to witness A, planes used in World War I, 2, breaking the sound barrier, C, first nonstop unrefueled world flight, or D, both A and B. So I'm going to go to the chat and see what people think. A lot of people are saying D. And you're right. You're right. It's remarkable to me how compressed aviation history is. The idea that Orville Wright lives not only to see World War I and all of the planes in World War I, but he lives to, I think, 1949 and sees Chuck Yeager break the sound barrier. I'm just phenomenal. I mean, to give you an idea of how compressed aviation history is, Edwin Aldrin knew the Wright brothers, and he knew Lindbergh, and his son went to the moon with Neil Armstrong. I mean, how crazy is that? So it's exciting. Okay, and then there are aerograms. So these are, it has an indicia on it. It's it might be embossed, or but these are, another thing that we'll collect. And then first day covers. Sometimes the traditional kinds of ones, like you can see C4, 5, and 6 over here. Here's the first booklet, the C10A. And I like showing this. It's not really a cover. It's a top of a box top. But I like showing this because it says something about context. When you look at this 80-cent stamp, that used stamp has a value of about 5 cents. If you have it on a first day cover, it's worth $5. But if you have it on a box top, it's worth $200. And if you have it on a box that they sent flowers in from Hawaii, and you have the complete box, it's worth $3,000. So postal history and the context and the rarity associated with showing it in the way in which it was used has some real value. It adds real value to it. And so for all of the people that are just used to seeing something with an art craft on it, there are lots of different ways to have first aid covers, and some of these are more interesting ones. And then I just kind of called it the Americas. I didn't know what else to call it, but Alaska, for example, got airmail very early. They started flying in 1924, actually as early as 1920, and for very good reasons. It turns out that the distances to cover in Alaska and the number of usable roads just don't lend themselves well to people driving. So if you were going to get someplace, you needed to give it to a bush pilot, and they would land on the water with floats, or someplace where they could put the plane down. So in addition to early airmail, we also had the Alaska Airlines, which was in the 1930s, and there were lots of emergency airmail routes in the 1930s. And this is just so that the government can continue to deliver mail to people, and it's just not possible. It is so difficult up there to do things without aircraft. And then same thing with Canada. The distances are just so immense that if you're going to get places, you really need to start airmail service early. And one of the interesting features about Canadian airmail, you can see this one on the right, it has a label on the back of it, and we call that a semi-postal, because there were bush companies that would carry the mail, and they would produce their own stamps. So this is the first label. This is from a 1926 flight, and the post office preferred that the labels be put on the back of the envelopes so that they wouldn't be confused as being stamps. Now, this one doesn't have a denomination on it, but the next one that looks very similar to that does have a denomination, and most of them do. And then the Canal Zone, which ended up being very important between World War I and World War II. There was a heavy German influence in the area, and we were concerned about if we went to war with Germany, what that would be like if someone would take control of the canal. So we had this, here's the headquarters, the Panama Canal Department for the US Army. And some mixed franking there. Then a lot of flight to Cuba. Our first foreign airmail flight was between Miami and Havana. Here you can see some sensor tape where they closed it up after a sensor had a chance to look at the interior. This one here on the left is actually a Lindbergh cover, Lindbergh first flight. And then Mexico, some wonderful wonderful stamps, and just very colorful. And Newfoundland. And what's interesting about Newfoundland is because it juts so far out into the Atlantic, most of the pioneering transatlantic flights would start out in the St. John's area. So it ends up having an outsized importance to aerophilately, even though not a lot of people live there and not that much mail is transacted there. And then kind of, I don't know, I called it air post history. And so, I mean, there are people who are interested in rates. They want to know, when did the new rate happen? When was the last date of the old rate? And they'll collect that. So here you see somebody who's got a pair of C11s on a last day of the airmail rate before it went down to 5 cents. And then international rates. And here you can see these are Prexy Solos. So each one pays a specific rate. So here's the 12-cent. It's going from Miami to Rio. The 15-cent, that's got an interesting date. It's December 8th, 1941. So that's the first day of the war, for World War II. The 30-cent would get you out to Midway, and 50 cents would get you around the world. So people that are interested in rates, airmail is definitely the way to go. And then we had this curious period. I think it was about 5 months or so. 1934, the president decides that the airlines have colluded to fix rates on the movement of airmail, and he decides to cancel the contracts. So he goes to the Army and says, "I want you guys to fly the mail." So within a span of about 10 days, the Army gets itself in gear and does this. And that sounds like a pretty easy thing, because if you think about our military today and our aviators, they're pretty competent people. I mean, they're definitely can do, follow orders, great great equipment. But here in 1934, things were very different. They're still flying the planes that were left over from the war in 1918. They don't have much in the way of navigation. They don't fly at night. They don't fly in bad weather. And airmail pilots have to do that, right? They have to get someplace on time. They have to be able to meet the train, or get it to the airmail field and get it out to the trucks that are delivering the mail. So you can't just say, well, it's raining, I'm not going to go, or it's dark. And so what ended up happening was there were a lot of accidents. Several people got killed. And so it was kind of a trial by fire, and Congress got involved, and they were pretty upset. But one of the things it ended up doing is highlighting that the Army and the Navy needed more money for aviation. And so when we were ready to fight the next war, we weren't in good shape, but we were in better shape. And for some of these people who this was kind of their first operation, you can see this middle one, it says Curtis LeMay. So he's a second lieutenant pilot in 1934, but he goes on to work for Jack Kennedy as the head of Strategic Air Command, and probably the most feared and respected Air Force general of all time. And over on the right, it says Benjamin Falloy. And Falloy is an interesting character. He was the first military aviator. So he's working in San Antonio, and the Army Signal Corps decides that they're going to buy an airplane from the Wright brothers, and they send it to Falloy, and they say, "Teach yourself to fly." And so he does this by correspondence with the Wright brothers, and he cracks up all the time, but eventually he gets his act together. And so he ends up being in charge of the Air Corps in 1934. And again, how compressed the timeline is. So here's Falloy, who knew the Wright brothers well. And yet when Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom are getting medals for being in the Mercury program, Falloy is the one who's putting them on in 1961. I mean, I find it amazing. And then we have something called interrupted mail. And that happens for lots of different reasons, right? And sometimes the interruption doesn't really damage the airplane or doesn't really slow down the mail. And so we cut it some slack, but we've had some pretty horrific accidents. So here, the one on the left, it says airplane nosedive into Halifax River. And one of the things that you notice is they dry it out. I mean, they normally take the mail to the nearest bakery and put it in the oven and dry the envelopes out, but the stamps got washed away, right? So that's pretty common with this crash mail. And the one on the bottom, you can see some of them didn't fare very well. Sometimes they're burnt, sometimes they've got oil stains, and they'll generally have some kind of an indication that they've been in a crash. And fortunately for people that collect airmail, Ken Sanford, past president of the Airmail Society, has just put together the World Crash Airmail and the US Crash Airmail, and he's worked on this for several years, and it just came out. And instead of making it into this enormous tome that you have to lug around, it's a credit card, and we sell it for 30, 35 bucks, something like that. It's 2,200 pages long, and he has it both in a PDF and also in Word. So you can take it and move it around and do whatever you want with it. And maybe that's the future of publications, because printing 2,200 page books on crash mail is probably not in anybody's best interest. And then one of my favorites, the most famous airmail pilot from America was Charles Lindbergh. He was the chief test pilot for CAM2, which was the spur between St. Louis and Chicago. And I've decided that I want to collect. He did about 130 flights, inaugural flights, and he's probably carried, I estimate, over 1 million pieces of mail. So, I mean, if you wanted a piece of Lindbergh mail, you go on eBay and you spend $5 and you can get one. So it's not expensive, but some of them are quite rare. So, for example, this one on the bottom, it says airmail test trip. So Raymond Barr was a friend of Lindbergh's who ended up taking care of the Spirit of St. Louis, and he was a stamp collector. And he said, okay, well, I'll give you some test envelopes. And the week before CAM2 was supposed to kick off, he went and did the route to make sure that that there was a place to get gas, he could get a sandwich, he could transfer the mail if there weren't any obstructions, things like that. So he checked out Springfield and Peoria, and so it turns out, and it's signed by Conklin, who's the postmaster at Springfield, and by Lindbergh, the pilot. And so there were 11 of these, and several of them are in museums at this point. So I figure there may be five or six of these that are still floating around. So this is the beginning of my exhibit, and I'm very pleased with that. And this one over on the left is even rarer. This one, it turns out, that was going from British Guiana to Haiti, there were only 4 envelopes in 1929. So now how many have survived from 1929? I don't know, but I'm going to try to get all 130 of these, and I'm at about 115. So I'm in the hunt. And then there's something we didn't really know what to call it, so we called it souvenir historic. So this is kind of, if you go into your kitchen and you have a miscellaneous drawer, I mean, everybody's got a miscellaneous drawer. That's what's here. But what I started to do is I said, well, are these all just souvenir historic, or are they something else? So I went and looked at all the ones in souvenir historic, but they could also be balloon post or pioneer or canal zone, or any of these other things. They kind of appear in both places. So that's kind of interesting. And then there's polar philately. The second volume of the 7th edition is just on aerophilately related to the polar regions. And what a wonderfully rich book. That's well worth getting. Anybody that wants to collect polar airmail needs to have the 7th edition volume 2. That's Hal Vogel's work, and he is the absolute best with polar aerophilately. So this is an envelope that was carried by Admiral Byrd on one of his pioneering flights, where they're doing a lot of mapping of terrain, and it's a wonderful, wonderful series. And then recently, I guess in volume 3 of the 7th edition, we did Amelia Earhart, which was kind of neat. So she's kind of the Lady Lindy. So, kind of awkward, gangly, dedicated to airmail. So in the upper left-hand corner, you see she's signed this postcard from the Boston chapter of the National Association of Aeronautics. And so it's welcoming Amelia Earhart and these 2 pilots, Stultz and Gordon. And Earhart, who was a pilot, wanted to fly across the Atlantic, but they decided that Stultz and Gordon were going to do the flying, and she was just going to sit there. So when she wrote her book, she said, I sat there like a sack of potatoes. That was her contribution. She just sat in the plane. But she was, she was celebrated when she got over as the first woman to come across on an airplane. But subsequent to that, she did some really remarkable flying. So this second envelope here was supposed to go on her round the world flight. The Gimbel's stamp department in the department store would sell these, and they were a couple of bucks, or for like $5 you could get it autographed by the pilot, and she was going to take it around the world. Well, she took off, and one of the landing gear collapsed, and she had to kind of start over again. She sent the plane to to Lockheed in California, and they fixed it up. And so they ended up doing more envelopes. They called it the second takeoff. You can see here. And so these envelopes are a lot more scarce. And this is a very unusual piece. This is a cachet made with linoleum on a ship that was out in Howland Island, where she was going to land in the middle of the Pacific. And a bunch of the radio operators and stuff signed the back of this thing. And you can see it doesn't have a postmark because they kept waiting for her to show up, and she never showed up. And it's a mystery what happened to her, but it's clear to me that that she wasn't able to find the island. She ran out of gas, and that was that. I mean, there were people that thought that maybe she was interred by the Japanese, or that she's still alive someplace, but no, I think she just ran out of gas. And then there's something called aerial propaganda, and psych ops in the military will take leaflets and throw them out of airplanes so that the enemy will read something that we want them to read. So it might say something like, if you surrender to Americans, you'll be treated well, or you'll be given a reward, or the people that you're fighting for don't care about you, or whatever it is that we think will encourage people to defect, to give up. And then some people collect markophily. So here they're collecting the postmark. It's not the route or the rate or the stamps or anything like that. They're interested in the postmark. And it turns out that at airmail fields, there's often a branch of the post office. And so it might say AMF on it, or airmail field, and that's where they process a lot of this mail. So there are people that collect AMF circle date stamps. This is one that I enjoy a lot. Around the World covers. So the one in the lower right, this is just before the 1939 World's Fair, and Howard Hughes and his team fly around the world, and he made up a bunch of covers. They weren't sold, but they were given out as favors. So they're kind of hard to find. Some of the more recent ones, Learjet here, associated with Hitachi, flew around the world, and you can see they were able to do that in a span of just 4 days. And then Steve Fawcett, who had all kinds of records, not only in aircraft, but also in balloons, did the first solo nonstop around the world flight in a Burt Rutan design. And that was, he did that leaving out of Kansas and flying back to Kansas. And you can see it's autographed by him. And he was able to do it in 61 hours. Pretty amazing. And then there's a whole fun category that I'm just going to call it experimental. So balloon mail. So the one in the lower right-hand corner, this is a stratospheric balloon flight, and we would send up an astronomer, or we'd send up a physicist to look at cosmic rays, and they'd go up to elevations of 70, 80, 90,000 feet, and either have a telescope, or they'd have Geiger counters, or things like that, and they're doing scientific experiments. And so this was in conjunction with the National Geographic Society and the Army Air Corps. And when they were done with the balloon, they cut it up and made bookmarks out of it and gave it to people with their membership with the American Geographic Society. So that's kind of fun. Catapult mail, what an interesting idea. So let's think about mail from a business perspective. Let's say that you're a bank and you're trying to clear canceled checks. So if you give the checks to the purser on a ship that's going across the Atlantic, it takes however long it takes to get across the Atlantic. You take the checks off, you clear them, and you get your money. But what if you could fly the mail faster than the ship? Well, the problem is that in this time, in the late 20s, aircraft couldn't fly across the Atlantic. Now, Lindbergh was kind of an exception. He was able to do that, but he had 17 different gas tanks. He had them configured so that he had no windscreen in front of him. I mean, he had to look out, put his head out the window to be able to see anything. I mean, that's no way to fly. So what they came up with was they said, well, what if we could launch an airplane from a ship when it was close enough that the airplane could make it? So when it was about a day or two out from docking, they would catapult this airplane off, and it would show up a day or two early. And now you'd pay a real premium for that. Here you can see this is in it says plane from ship to shore, and it's $1 for a half ounce. So it's pretty considerable. But if you had important business mail and you wanted something to go real express, this was the way to do it. You know, you can save yourself a day or two by sending it by catapult. Now, you know, by the late 30s, this doesn't make any sense anymore. I mean, we're flying airplanes across the Atlantic, but for this little window of a couple of years, it was an interesting concept. And how about glider mail? So in World War II, we needed to move a lot of troops, and we didn't have enough capacity to build enough engines for airplanes, but we could build a bunch of gliders. So you build these troop carriers, airplanes, but they don't have engines, and you tie a rope around the back of a tow plane, you pull it up to altitude, he releases the tow rope, and he's able to glide in and take the troops off. So they did that in World War II. And actually, there was a commercial effort to deliver glider mail, the Lustig SkyTrain flights. And you can see that was going to Baltimore and Washington. And they tried it for a little while. What they were doing was they were taking aircraft that were left over from World War II and trying to kind of make a go of it. And it worked a little bit for a little time, but it wasn't really sustainable. But then there's also glider competitions, and that's not really moving the mail, but these are carried on gliders, and so we find them collectible. And rocket mail, how about that? So the one on the left was a Regulus 1 missile. It's a cruise missile, and it was fired from the deck of a submarine. It's about 200 miles off the coast of Jacksonville in Florida. And this thing rockets up, and it's going supersonic, and it's carrying 3,000 of these greetings from the Postmaster General. And they foam the runway, and this thing comes screaming in and lands, and they pull out the mail, and the Postmaster General is ecstatic. He puts out a press release, and he says, it was amazing. We got the mail to move. You know, we've been moving the mail by stagecoach, and then by truck, and then by train, and now we've got it going supersonic. And he says, before you know it, mail is going to be flying on missiles going into cities all over the world. And I'm thinking, maybe not the best idea. So we tried this once, but didn't do it again. I like mine here because it's probably the only rocket mail that's addressed to Kuala Lumpur, because we sent to the 100 members of the Universal Postal Union, we sent them each one of these, as well as to generals and captains of industry and things like that. And you can do space mail now. So I sent this one on the right, showing me in my spacesuit, and this was sent up with Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. And so he has this thing for STEM and for kids to get involved in space stuff. And he says, if you send me a postcard, I'll put it in the spaceship, and I'll put this little blue thing that says that it's been in space, and send it back to you. So I'm a volunteer with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I give talks about aerospace history and things like that. So I showed him my space mail. All right, you ready for question number 3? This is the last one, bottom of the 9th. So the night before the first flight to the moon, the Apollo astronauts dined with A, Chuck Yeager, B, Jimmy Doolittle, C, Amelia Earhart, or D, Charles Lindbergh. So let's see how people. Okay, I see a bunch of Yeagers. Nobody's going to go for Earhart. Okay, there's a Lindbergh, B+. All right. Okay. Well, you guys know that we flew to the moon in 68, right? And Earhart disappeared in 37. So we're not gonna accept that one. The correct answer is Limburg. So here is Limburg having dinner. He and his wife, Anne, are having dinner with the Apollo 8 crew. And the next day they go to the moon. I mean, how amazing is that? And Limburg led the most phenomenal life. I mean, not only was he an airmail pilot and did lots of things in aviation, but he was an environmentalist and he did a lot of things for national defense. I mean, during World War II, the president didn't want to give him a commission because Limburg had said he had this group called America First. He felt that America should not be involved in a European war. I mean, they'd seen what happened with the Great War of World War I and thought that America shouldn't be fighting overseas. So, so he tried to keep us out of the war. But once it was clear that we were in the war, he wanted to go in with both feet. And the president said, you know, you haven't been very helpful to me, so no. But he ended up becoming a tech rep for one of the aviation companies, and he went overseas. He went to the Pacific, and he was able to help the fighter pilots to extend the range of their aircraft. So and it was some phenomenal amount. It was from like 6 hours of flying to 9 or something like that. So fuel management issues, and that ended up being very, very helpful. So and then he ended up working on figuring out what we should do with strategic air command and all kinds of things. So Limburg did a lot of stuff, and he had dinner with the astronauts. All right, and we also we do supersonic Concorde mail, and every couple of years, somebody touts that we're going to go and do that again. These are incredibly inefficient, noisy playthings for the rich. And you know, of all the things that we could be doing for aviation, for transportation, we keep going back to this idea because they're beautiful and they're incredibly fast and elegant. And someday we'll have these things again. And then we've got, I'm going to call it transoceanic. And so there's kind of that North Atlantic kinds of things and South Atlantic and Pacific. The Pacific is fascinating because, you know, when you think about it, if we're going to get anywhere in the Pacific, it has to be with airplanes, right? Ships just don't cut it. So this whole business of Pan American clippers going to Wake Island and going to Midway and in the mid 30s was critical. And when we ended up getting involved with the war with Japan, it was particularly critical, you know, that we had Hawaii and that we got Wake and Midway back, and so. And then there was something called the Dorner, the DOX. It's just this massive plane, and it had 3 different segments where it kind of flew around the world. It took about a year or so. And here you can see it's got a nice overprint here on the Newfoundland stamps. So it's $1.50 to send this envelope. So it was not cheap. And here you can see one coming out of Brazil. But yeah, we've got people collecting that. And then I'm going to call it foreign airmail. So you know, there are lots of Zeppelin flights, right? There, I mean, Seeger's got like 500 different flights, and lots of it's philatelic, and you can get them fairly inexpensively. But here's an interesting one. So this has some really nice seahorses on it, high value seahorses, and it has a 1 pound stamp. And this pays the exact correct rate to go from Germany to Rio. So this is a very special cover. And then under like World Pioneer stuff, like this is the first airmail flight. And well, this is the first one in the United Kingdom in 1911. Yeah. It says from London to Windsor, and it comes in different colors and That's kind of neat. And then foreign flags. So here's Pan American, and they team up with other companies in Latin and South America to provide services. And then there's some other stuff that, I don't know, I called it something, call it, U.S. events. So airport dedications. Here's one for Will Rogers. I like this one on the lower right. That's quite a cachet. And so people will do dedications. And then there's National Airmail Week, which is just unbelievable. So James Farley, and I don't know if the president did this or this was Farley's idea, but they decided that they wanted to promote the use of airmail. So they came up with this week in 1938, and the president designs this stamp, this 6-cent eagle stamp, and they decide that they're going to tell everybody in the country that they should collect, that they should send somebody a letter by airmail. Well, it was tremendously exciting, and so many people got into it. It's unbelievable. I've got somebody in my society who says he's going to collect all of them, all of the ones from different places. There are 12,000 of them. There are 12,000 different ones. So don't do it. Don't do it. That's all I'm going to say. And then there were U.S. airships. We have the Zeppelins, which are German, and one of the German ones we ended up getting as reparations, and we changed the name, made it to Los Angeles, and here it is going to Bermuda. And then we have the Akron, and it carried a little bit of mail. And so what do you collect? I guess to me, so much of postal history has occurred in this wonderful period, 1918, 1975. There are routes and rates and so much history, and it's all tied together with aviation. And I would welcome you to check us out. It's our 100th anniversary, where we turn 100 in September, and we're looking forward to our next century. And we would love for you to join us.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed the presentation. I've got some questions, and we'll go through as many as we can. I want to stick to the promised hour for the folks that are watching. The first question I have is, the new catalogs are a little confusing. I collect TWA. There used to be several contract airmails for different routes. Now there's only one. I am confused about how to catalog my collection. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the collector is absolutely right. It's confusing, and not just to him. The way in which we've produced catalogs since 1935 is we've had a specialist who said, I collect contract airmail. I have the finest contract airmail collection, and he's made copies of the covers in his collection. He's written everything that he knows. And then when that section is ready, or transoceanic or FAMs or first flights, then we publish it. And it doesn't bear any relationship to things that we've published in the past, which must drive dealers nuts, because what they want is, they want a consistent, they want to know, what is something worth and what is its catalog number. And if you change the catalog numbers, or you don't tell me what it's worth, then what good are you? And for collectors, they want a roadmap, and they deserve a roadmap. In our second century, what we're doing right now is we're making a little bit of a pivot, and you could see that with Ken Sanford's work, where instead of printing a 2,200 page book, we just put it on a card and sell it for $30. So we want to continue to do the research, and we want to get that out to collectors, but we need a different model, because in the last one, Airmails of Canada and Newfoundland, which we put out in the last several months, it had 28 authors and took 7 years to produce. So that's untenable. And I know, Scott, that you and your organization, it's difficult to collect the information and present it in a usable format, and share it with people. And so that's something that we're working on right now. And I think what needs to happen, I think the way to go forward is, instead of finding a individual who wants to write something up, is that we crowdsource things. We create a data repository. We have people put their covers in there and what they know about it. And then when we reach a critical mass, we'll go ahead and publish it. But the short answer to that collector is, I'm sorry, it's a problem. We're working on it.
Well, I will say this. I've talked to several folks in specialty societies, and crowdsourcing is that, technology sort of allows it to happen these days, where we can upload those images and start having a group of people really start looking through it. And then there being one final arbiter, but I think there does create a little bit more continuity and consistency that way. So good luck with that, but we strongly encourage it just based on the feedback we've been hearing.
Yeah, it needs to happen.
All right. Next question sounds more like a pop quiz, but I'm going to see if you know the answer to it.
Okay.
I have a philatelic cover postmarked Grove City, PA, May 14th, 4:30 p.m., 1939, franked with USC 23 and cashier'd with wings and propeller and scroll US airmail experimental pickup and first flight number AM 1001
Right.
and Grove City, PA.
Yep.
What was the experimental pickup?
Oh yeah, this is delightful. They were doing this. A guy named Dr. Little, or Lytle, I guess his name was, at the Chicago Century of Progress in 1933, set up this system where you'd put up two poles and you'd run a string in between it, and you'd hang the bag of mail, and the plane would come by with a hook and it would pick up the mail. So it was an experimental mail pickup. And they did this with trains too. You'd have a bag that you'd put on a pole, and the train would go by and it would kind of pick up the bag. Well, they did this. So there were all these experimental pickups where a plane would fly by and it wouldn't land. It would just pick up the mail. And that's what that is.
Interesting. Next question. I often see the online auction sites covers autographed by aviators, astronauts, cosmonauts. So there's clearly interest in collecting such covers. Where do you see them fitting in?
Well, there are people that consider astrophilately, which is the intersection of space and postal history, as part of aerophilately. And, from an FIP perspective, they are separate. They are different classes. But because we accept rocket mail as kind of airmail, we kind of accept space stuff as it too. So we're kind of loosey-goosey on that.
Okay. This next question is great. I'm interested in collecting Clipper flight covers, both Pacific and Atlantic routes. Where should I start?
Well, what I would do is I'd get a copy of John Krupnick's book. John has had a number of award-winning, particularly Pacific Pan Am Clipper stuff, and he's done a couple of books on it. And if you can't get it at APS, I don't know whether or not you have it in your store.
We do have that. We do have both versions of John's book in our store.
Oh yeah, okay. So it's a 11 by 17 and also an 8.5 by 11. That can give you all kinds of ideas, and I would start there, and also join the society.
That's why that was my favorite question.
Yeah.
How were catapult rockets recovered when they got to land, and how controlled were the flights?
Well, it didn't seem to be a problem. I don't know whether or not they were float planes. They may have been, or whether they were wheeled planes. I think most of them were float planes. So I think they would come up to the shore and offload the mail. I'm not sure is the answer.
Okay. Do you know of any special airmail covers going to Vietnam on planes flying troops to the war zone from San Francisco to Saigon?
I'm sure there was. The military has their own postal service, and those are either APOs or FPOs, and they carry mail in and out of war zones. And for the majority of service people in active combat zones, they generally don't have to put stamps on their envelopes. so they can just write soldier mail or just write free on it, and and they can have that delivered. So the answer is yes. There's definitely mail that was carried into Vietnam during that period.
I'm going to end with this question. This was a fun one that I chuckled over, David, but and we shared this before the presentation started. I want to know if your title of your presentation, 47 Ways to Collect Airmail, was inspired by the song 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover.
Well, it could have either been that. It's Paul Simon, right?
That's right.
Yeah, or the other one that I was thinking, and I went and I Googled it because I'm like, 47, is that right? So I went to go and see the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, because I know that there's an ultimate question in that book, and the answer is 42. So I think as we go forward, maybe it becomes 50, maybe it becomes 42, but suffice to say, there are lots of wonderful ways to collect. It's a delicious area, and we would welcome people to come and join us.
And I would say this, that I think it's a fair use to be able to use that in an education presentation.
Yep.
I don't think Paul Simon would be offended at all or bothered by it in the least.
Yeah, he's got bigger fish to fry than us.
One last question before we call it quits. Can you comment on detecting forgeries and counterfeits? You're in the expertising side of what we do here, so you may have some good insight on this.
Well, my expertise is very, very limited, and I would not describe myself as a aerophilatelist expert of anything. I've been doing this space stuff for a long time, and while I don't provide certificates for autographs, I'm pretty good at determining what's an autograph, what's genuine and what's not. But principally in astrophilately, the value is in the postmark, and I can detect the forgeries with that. So with aerophilately, there are all kinds of ways of faking things, and there are a lot of people a lot smarter than me. So, but I'm very proud of being a member of the APS Apex group. It's a wonderful group of about 160 people who really enjoy their little slice of philately and share it with others.
Absolutely true. And David, I just want to thank you. This has been an incredible presentation. You were right out of the gate ready to volunteer when we decided to restart Stamp Chats, and I want to thank you for that. This is a great way to start it and a wonderful way to commemorate airmail. You can learn more about airmail through the American Airmail Society. David and I are both proud members at AmericanAirmailSociety.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the APS YouTube page for all of our future Stamp Chats. If you're not a member of the APS, please join today and become a part of our Stamp community. For more information, visit us at stamps.org. Till next time, thank you very much.